Hello, everyone. Welcome again to Page Out 2021, and welcome to the book launch and reading with Odolina Roznov, who writes as Adolina Nina Soa. You're all welcome. Odolina is a lecturer in new media, and she's also a writer and illustrator. Her research is in new media. Today, we will launch the contest and other Spiderman Tales. This book is a retelling of 7 Anansi stories. Odolina illustrated them as well. And before we go into it, I just would like for you to indulge me. How many of you have read or heard an Anansi story? Okay. And I'm curious about when last you heard or read one. So if you could still keep your hand up, I will come to you and...
Hi, about 20 years ago, my husband told me the Anansi stories.
Okay.
About 2 months ago.
About 2 months ago. Okay, that's pretty recent. Who else?
Just yesterday.
That's interesting. Oh, you read one
Today, yeah.
Okay.
20 years ago.
Ah, right. Okay. So it's interesting. It's interesting
my
that
reference.
had them 20 years ago, just yesterday, just this morning. It's really good. There are a few questions I had about Odolina, especially because she's Ghanaian Russian. I was interested in how she came to Anansi stories, why she has decided to retell these particular 7 stories, and why she has illustrated them the way they are. If you look at the cover of the book, it's pretty unusual for the Anansi stories that a lot of us are used to. So there are many questions, but Odolina will do us a favor and talk us through how these stories came to be, why she has illustrated them that way. We'll do some readings and we'll take questions from the audience. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amma. I'm really excited to be here at the launch of my book. And I'd like to thank everyone who is here to share my journey and the backstory to the creation of this work. So a little bit generally about the book and what it consists of. So it consists of its stories, 7 Anansi stories, and I've retold these stories and illustrated them. The idea behind the work was to find a new aesthetic in the pictorial representation of Anansi. So I was more interested in exploring how can I think more about this character and represent the character in a different way. So as to the question that why did I pick the stories that are in the book, the 7 stories? Well, my criteria for picking the as well as media and globalization and intercultural communication, they all sort of factor into this book. So after I got my main material, which was the 7 stories, I set a task for myself as an illustrator, which was first to capture the vibrant and dynamic nature of Anansi. So I thought about Anansi and I asked myself, what are some of the things, the attributes do I think of when I think about the Spider-Man? And so I made a list of some of his internal characters. So basically what I did is I set out to identify the list of his internal characteristics and then as an illustrator, find an external expression to those internal characteristics. So to go back and set context, can we please have the next slide? So I looked at how Anansi, okay, thank you. I looked at how Anansi is often pictorially represented. Here on this slide, I have a few examples. So in our contemporary popular culture, usually, pictorially especially, Anansi is represented as a man who is past his prime, so maybe an older man. And then characteristically, Anansi always has a huge pot belly that alludes to his greed and also to, I think, his age. And him being older and having a pot belly, to me, suggested that he is sedentary, he has a sedentary lifestyle, that Anansi is very sluggish, and also that Anansi has a Anansi is lazy, has a lazy disposition. But when I read all these 7 stories, I realized that something was at odds, because in most of these stories, and if you're familiar with not just the stories I have in the book, but many of the Anansi stories, we find that Anansi is always being chased. He's always running away. People are running to chase him with a stick to punish him. He is always thinking very quickly. He's always hustling. He's thinking really, really fast, and this and always on go. And so when I put all these characteristics together, they somehow didn't fit into the that's depicted here of an older man, maybe sluggish, with a big pot belly. To me, those 2 images seemed rather at odds. And so I will give you a few examples out of my stories. I have a list here. So, for example, in the wisdom pot, we have Anansi holding a huge pot, and he's climbing up a tree. The pot is holding the whole of the world's wisdom, and he's climbing up. Well, that takes quite a lot of energy. It requires a lot of agility. We see him, tying up a huge python, which is much bigger than he is. And in other stories, we see him crawling, climbing, and running quickly from his adversaries or from the people that he has wronged and who want to chase him and beat him up or punish him for his wrongdoing. So Anansi is usually cunning, quick-witted, brazen, always on the go. And to me, I saw this character as really full of life. And his constant scheming and exhibition of problem-solving skills and all the escapades that are recounted in the story, the moral implications notwithstanding, actually showed me that the Spider-Man, Anansi, has a very proactive attitude to life rather than reactive. So we can talk about, please, next slide. So we can talk about his mental acuity, Anansi's sharp power of observation, his boldness, his ability to take quick and calculated risks, something that we see in many of his stories. And I thought with all those characteristics, Anansi reminded me of the millennials of today, with his boldness, ability to take quick and calculated risk, always hustling and bustling, always proactive, very much like a millennial. And by the way, Anansi believes in working smarter rather than harder, just like the millennials do. So as an illustrator, I decided to focus on this particular instance of Anansi, his love of life, his vibrancy, wit, and to take these internal characteristics and then depict them externally through his movement and through a new depiction of Anansi. So can we please go on to the next slide? So there were two influences, in my work, in my illustrative work. And the first one was South African rock art. And the second one was the illustrations of Arthur Rackham. He's an English artist and illustrator. His illustrations of Cinderella by C.S. Evans, which was published all the way back in 1919. So on the slide you see two examples, one from South African rock art and the illustrations of Arthur Rackham. So can we please see the next slide? So just a little bit about South African rock art. So South African rock art, which is associated with the San and the Khoisan populations of Southern Africa, consists of the largest amount of rock art in the world. It varies in techniques, that's paintings and petroglyphs. Paintings as in pigment applied to a surface, here is rock, or petroglyphs where a sharp object is used to scratch out the surface of the rock and to create a drawing when the rock that's been scratched undergoes certain chemical processes and becomes darker and creates an outline as in a drawing. So a lot of the rock
Hello.
Hello?
Hello? Yep. My love affair with South African rock art started a very long time ago. I visited the Matobo National Park in 2000. That was a trip we made with my family, and that is when I first saw South African rock art in person. And it left such an incredible impression on me. It's probably one of the most exciting memories that I have in my life. Yes, and so this formed one of my influences. And looking at these examples, most of the rock paintings are done in monochrome or bichrome. And one of the things that stuck out to me when I saw the rock art was how emotionally evocative it was, how expressive it was, even though it looks very, very simple on the surface. So one of the things that I noticed is the expressive movement through the use of line and rhythm. I also noticed that even though it was emotionally so engaging and interesting and lively, we don't have here a depiction of the human face. Here I'm alluding to facial mimicry. We don't see eye, nose, mouth, and these are the things that normally we look at in order to be able to read someone's emotional state or their thoughts. So we look at the facial mimicry right here, and we also look at body language. So I thought, well, we don't see there's no facial mimicry at work in this, and yet it is so expressive. And so I noted it at that time. And the last point is that in most of the rock art that I saw there at that time, and the others that I've seen later, have very little depiction of landscape or setting. So for example, we don't have homes or details or a whole lot of props that are in there. We mostly see minimal props. We mostly see these figures who are caught in the process of movement. So going to my second source of inspiration, please can we move to the next slide? So yeah, so that's another example of the South African rock art, what I saw in Matobo Hills. Please, can we move on to the next slide? Okay, so that's that. Okay, again, figures running. And then we move on to Arthur Rackham, which is my second inspiration. And so these are two works that seemingly have absolutely nothing in common. South African rock art produced by the Sankoi people as part of, which are ritualistic in nature. And here we have illustrations by an English artist, Arthur Rackham, and then for a book. So what I liked about this work, and this is one of my favorite illustrative works, is the use of silhouette. And again, I had the same feelings when I saw these illustrations, I went through the book. I realized how expressive they were, how emotionally engaging the book was thanks to these illustrations. And again, I noticed the similarity, just as in the rock art which we just saw, which there is very little facial mimicry that's depicted. We see a little more of the face, we see as a silhouette the nose and the mouth, but we don't see much more. So just like with the rock art, we have bichrome or monochrome. In the South African rock art, we have monochrome here, which is silhouette. We have a very little depiction of setting or landscape, and the use of facial mimicry is minimal, as in this case. So please, can we have the next slide? Okay, another example. Silhouettes. We can see something of the face, but it's still, the facial mimicry is reduced. Next slide. The same thing. I did fit in one example, just one illustration of, I think there are 2 or 3. There's one example where there is some setting, but that's more the exception to the rule. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the commonalities that I found between these two works that seem to have absolutely nothing in common, seemingly. Now, yeah, so since I was concerned with finding an external expression to Anansi's internal attributes that I described earlier, I felt that his expressiveness, Anansi's expressiveness, should come through the depiction of body movement first and foremost, and not through facial mimicry. So just synthesizing these two influences together. So, so I decided to work in black and white, take color out, again alluding to my influences, not to rely on facial mimicry, as many other earlier illustrations of Anansi stories often depict Anansi's face, and we see the facial mimicry of Anansi and other characters in the story. So I decided to take that out, and then the last decision was to, as in the South African rock art, and somewhat like Rackham did, not to include the depiction of setting and landscape. So these are the sort of defining stylistic characteristics that I came down to before I started work. And I felt that those characteristics will allow me to focus more on capturing the internal attributes of Anansi, his vibrancy, his love of life, so that I can focus mostly on depiction of movement of Anansi, rather than be distracted by elements such as color, certain elements such as props and setting and so on. So all that we are going to be seeing is Anansi, the other characters involved in the story. The story will be told through Anansi and the other characters' movement. We will not have any depiction of facial mimicry. The movement is the only thing that is going to tell the story. But when I decided that I'm going to make this character, just like in the South African rock art, which is going to move actively, I realized that I had to get rid of the stomach. Because if I was going to take a character, let's say like a stick, and I was going to bend him, deform him in any way, as I would, I needed a pivot point, which is the stomach, from where I could bend him anyhow and create interesting movements. And so his stomach had to go. So that is sort of the journey to the evolution of my depiction of Anansi as you would see in the book. So I sketched, when I started my work, I sketched in pencil. Can we please have the next slide? Okay, so here I'm just showing you the limbs of the figures in South African arts, the way they are captured in movement. We see their legs are apart, their arms are depicting movement. This is a characteristic that I picked from there. Can we please see the next? Okay, so this is from Arthur Rackham, and the next slide, please. Yeah, so I took an illustration from Arthur Rackham, and then I just scratched out the heads where we have the facial mimicry. And you can see from the previous illustration and this illustration is that we can still see that the two characters are gossiping and saying something, which is probably not very good. And we don't see their faces. So the body is able to tell the story. The movement is able to tell the story. Okay, so if we can move next. So as I was sketching in pencils and doing numerous sketches of both Anansi and other characters, I was trying to work out various dynamic compositional schemes. And I had to watch spiders and how they move. They have a very particular movement. They have a certain lag implied in first the positioning, 4 limbs here, 4 limbs here, in seemingly working in antagonism, and include the lag of the movement as the spider moves. So I tried various dynamic compositional schemes, and in the process, which was really very interesting and I didn't anticipate, I had to literally, that word always gets my tongue tied up, I don't know why. I had to literally relive Anansi's escapades and become an extension of the Spider-Man. So what I mean by that is sometimes when I was drawing and I needed to capture the right movement and include all these little details that I spoke about, there were times where it was so challenging, despite the result looking quite simple, is that sometimes I had to stand in front of a mirror and I had to put myself as an actor would into that storyline and say, at this point, what is it that I'm feeling? And then I try to translate that feeling into my muscles, my body language, and then sometimes I'll just stand in the mirror and make observations and then carry those observations into my work. I have one little funny story about that. I had to depict a lizard that Anansi had fed, and he was overfed. His stomach was really huge, and he was lying down like he could hardly breathe. And I made so many sketches of that, and I couldn't get that quite right. The lizard looked like he wasn't so full that he could hardly breathe. He was full, but not quite full. And so I just left the drawing, and I admit I like fufu, light soup. So one time I went out, I had fufu and soup, and I hadn't had it for such a long time. It was very tasty, and I admit I ate too much. So I remember walking in through the front door with my stomach out there, and the first thing I did when I came in is I collapsed on the sofa and I did like this. Then I suddenly thought, oh, that is how probably the lizard felt after he met. So I just, Odelina, remember your muscles, like this, like that. And so that sort of, it even had to come to that in order to get my movements right. So in developing the actual pictorial depiction of Anansi, the style, if you will, what are the things that I did? So I altered Anansi's head to body ratio. I was guided by what I saw in the South African rock art. I emphasized his leanness, his malleability, and I spoke about that, getting rid of the stomach, making him slim without a stomach so I could bend him. And as I already mentioned, in opposition to predecessors' representation of Anansi, I created a very lean stomach that served as a pivot point from which I could bend the character at will. I reduced the size of the head. I reduced the head to body ratio. So in the end, I got a, please come and see the next slide. So in the end result was a stylized figure of a man, long and lean, and influenced by the depiction of the human figures in South African rock art. I made Anansi and other figures just like this, lean and more angular. So Anansi has a total of 8 limbs. One to allude to his spider beginning, but the other reason is, as I said, his internal attributes are being like a hustler, just doing things all the time and thinking and, mental agility and so on and so forth. So I wanted those 8 limbs to represent his ability to do more, to hustle more, and to get things more done in a specific chunk of time. So to use contemporary parlance to describe just what I said, Anansi needed the extra hands and legs in order to be on top of all his side hustles. So I painstakingly hand-painted all the figures. I worked in only one color, which is black on white, echoing Arthur Rackham's work. Painting the figures required a fair amount of precision. And the decisions that I made to ignore facial mimicry and setting and work with one color really allowed me to focus on finding ways through movement to depict the internal characteristics of Anansi as I had identified them at the very beginning. Can I please have the next slide? These are some examples of the illustrations. Can we have the next slide, please? The next, and the next. Next, yes, the next. Okay. So when I had completed the illustrations and I was putting everything together, I looked at the illustrations and the text. And then to me, it looked like the text looked so stiff and monolithic like a block, whilst the illustrations were so lively and the figures seemed to be almost jumping off the page. So I thought, okay, why don't I extend this obsession with movement or motion, if you will, into my text? So the way I did it was all the dialogue in the stories I made bold and I made put them in italic form. And the reason I did this is as soon as the text was boldened and in italic form, as you can see from what you have in front of you, the bold text seems to jump out a little bit to a front plane. And the other text, non-boldened text, seems to recede a little bit. And so that creates a sense of movement, implied movement in the text without really changing the text, so that the illustration and the text become unified as one in their depiction of movement. And to conclude, the process of capturing and depicting Anansi's internal, in the process of capturing and depicting Anansi's internal attributes, I found a striking resemblance and a newfound relevance of Anansi the Spider-Man to young Ghanaian millennials who they are no longer assured a job anymore, a job that you can keep till retirement. And they often have to rely on their own prowess and their own wit and to hustle their way every day through life. And if we are to generally understand hustle as meaning doing everything it takes to get things done, then Anansi, like any millennial, he also hustles and he does what he has to do to get the things that he wants and he needs simply by using his wit. So when we read his stories, and not only the ones in the book, but other stories as well, we find that, yes, he is deceitful, but we find stories where he is not. And sometimes he makes us laugh, and sometimes his choices do make us cringe. Yet, as we laugh or cringe, Anansi's stories never fail to remind us that we will all face the moral repercussions of all the actions and decisions we take as we go through the hustle of life. Thank you.
Those are really, really interesting insights on how the contest and other Spider-Man tales came to be. We have just a few more minutes to go, and we will take a reading.
Okay. This is a very well-known story also, called The Wisdom Pot. I wish I was the only wise person in the world, Anansi said to himself. He closed his eyes and smiled. Anansi was very greedy, so he picked up all the pieces of wisdom that he could find and hid them in a huge earthenware pot. Anansi then tried lifting up the pot, but it was very heavy. He stopped and scratched his beard. I need to hide the pot as soon as possible. I don't want anyone to find it. Anansi scouted the forest and found a huge tree. It was so tall that its branches seemed to reach the sky. Good, thought Anansi, smiling to himself. I will hide my pot in the topmost branches. No one will find it in there. He placed the heavy earthenware pot between his belly and stretched to grip the tree trunk. It was now midday, and sweat rolled down Anansi's face. His hands were tired and slippery. He could barely hold the tree trunk. Suddenly he heard a voice. He craned his neck to see who it was. It was Anansi's son, Intikuma, and he was staring at him. Father, he shouted, don't you think it would have been easier if you tied the pot to your back? Why is that? Yelled Anansi, furious that someone had seen him. Well, answered his son, if the pot is on your back, your hands will be free to grip the tree trunk and go up faster. Anansi realized that he may have had all the wisdom, but Intikuma still had some common sense left. The Spider-Man became so angry that his hands shook. The pot felt unbearably heavy. It slipped through Anansi's fingers and crashed down. The pot hit the ground with a frightening thud. The pieces of wisdom flew in all directions. The pieces went east, west, north, and south. Anansi screamed with rage and scrambled up the tree into its thick, lush greenery. He sat there in his web, weeping with anger and shame.
Okay, thank you very much, Odolina. Are there any questions from the audience? Questions? Okay, let's have you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I would just like to ask, what age group are you expecting to read the Anansi stories, please?
Well, if we are talking about children specifically, from 5 to 9, but the reality is Anansi has relevance to all of us, so it's from 5 to 105.
Okay, yes, so there we have it. The contest and other Spider-Man tales is available. It's relevant from 5 until 105. This has been a reading and insight into how the contest and other Spider-Man tales came to be with Odolina Rosinov, who writes as Adolina Nina Soa.
Adolika.
Adolika Nina Soa, sorry. Yes. The book is published by Dapabli, and it's run by Nana Damwa and Kofi Akpabli. If you would like to get a copy of the contest and other Spider-Man tales, it's out there at the Dapabli stand. Thank you all very much for indulging us. Thank you for coming to this look into how the book came to be and this reading. And I hope that we all leave here rethinking about Anansi, rethinking our relationship with Anansi stories, and then reading it as much as we can and hoping to get new insights every time we go into Anansi stories. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the sessions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your presence. Thank you.
This time you didn't hold your hair.